Hello, how are you? I'm Maya, and before we start, I would like to ask you to leave a note about where you're listening in the comments. These stories were sent to my personal email or heard in shifts from coworkers. If you want to share your story, you can find my email in the description section. Hope this video finds you well. The silence of a shopping mall after hours is a heavy, physical thing. It isn't the lack of sound. Rather, it's a presence. A suffocating blanket of stale, recycled air and the low-frequency hum of high-voltage transformers vibrating deep within walls that were never meant to be seen. When the thousands of people who fill these concrete cathedrals during the day finally leave, and the heavy iron gates groan into place, the building undergoes a profound and disturbing transformation. It ceases to be a place of commerce and becomes something far more primal, a hollowed-out carcass of human ambition, a monument to a world that moved on and left it behind. Most people don't realize that a mall is a living organism. It breathes through its massive HVAC systems. It circulates energy through miles of copper wiring. And it remembers. It remembers the laughter, the frantic pace of the holidays, and the millions of footsteps that have polished its linoleum floors over the decades. But when that energy stops, the vacuum it leaves behind is rarely empty. Something else moves into the corners. Something else begins to feed on the silence. Architects and sociologists often speak of liminal spaces, places that exist only as a transition between point A and point B. A hallway, an airport terminal at 4 a.m., a highway rest stop in the middle of a desert. These places feel inherently wrong when they are empty, because they are stripped of their purpose. A shopping mall is the ultimate liminal space. It is a contained universe, a dome of artificial light and curated happiness, designed specifically to distract us from the passage of time. There are no clocks in a mall. There are rarely windows to the outside world. It is an island of perpetual mid-afternoon, frozen in a state of eternal consumerism. But when the lights go out, that illusion shatters. The island is revealed to be a shipwreck, and the survivors are few and far between. As we begin this deep dive into the archives, we have to talk about the history of the American mall, a history that is inextricably linked to the rise of mechanical entertainment. In the 1970s and 80s, the Family Entertainment Center was the crown jewel of the retail experience. These weren't just places to eat pizza. They were stages for mechanical theater. This was the era of the animatronic band, creatures of foam, fur, and pneumatic cylinders that were designed to mimic life. They were meant to be whimsical, friendly, and inviting. But there is a reason why the uncanny valley exists. It is a survival mechanism wired into the deepest, oldest part of our brains. When we see something that looks human or animal, but its movements are jerky, its eyes are glassy, and its skin is just a little too smooth, our instinct screams at us to run. We recognize the mimicry, and we understand, on a subconscious level, that there is no soul behind those painted eyes. There is only the rhythmic clicking of rusted valves and the cold, unfeeling logic of a programmed loop. We are here to discuss what happens when those loops break. We are here to talk about the Oakridge Galleria, a name that, for many years, was synonymous with a specific kind of suburban dread. It was a massive 3-story structure built in the heart of the Midwest, a palace of neon and pastel that served as the social hub for 3 counties. But as the 2000s arrived, the Galleria began to rot. One by one, the anchor stores fled. The fountains were drained, leaving behind green-stained basins that smelled of stagnant water. The neon signs for Sbarro and Radio Shack flickered and died, leaving long stretches of the corridors in permanent darkness. It became what we now call a dead mall. It was during this period of decay that the rumors began. Rumors of things moving in the shadows of the empty food courts. Rumors of sounds, distorted music, mechanical whirring, and footsteps coming from boarded-up restaurants that hadn't seen a customer in 20 years. The local police logs from that era are filled with trespassing calls that ended with officers finding nothing but open doors and a lingering smell of ozone and old fur. But the people who worked there, the security guards, the janitors, the technicians who were tasked with maintaining a dying building, they knew the truth. They were the ones who saw the eyes reflecting their flashlight beams. They were the ones who realized that the mall's mascots hadn't been deactivated. They had simply changed their programming. The mall Animatronic Incident isn't just one event. It is a collection of tapes that point toward a terrifying conclusion. That when we abandon a place of intense human energy, that energy doesn't simply vanish. It is absorbed by the environment. It is trapped in the machines we built to mimic ourselves. And when the power grid groans and the building settles into the dark, those machines wake up. They aren't looking for applause. They aren't looking to sing songs about friendship. They are looking to reintegrate themselves into the world of the living by any means necessary. Before we delve into the first tape, I want you to consider the sensation of being watched. There is a scientific term for it: scopaesthesia. It is that prickle on the back of your neck, that sudden jolt of adrenaline when you realize you are not as alone as you thought. Imagine that sensation, but multiplied by the vastness of an empty mall. Imagine standing in the center of an atrium, looking up at 3 levels of darkened storefronts, and realizing that behind every shutter, every glass window, and every shadow, there is a pair of eyes that has been waiting for you to look away. This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is a journey into the architectural and psychological abyss. We are going to examine the visceral terror of the Captain Cuddles incident, a story that begins with a young security guard named Elena, who thought she was just taking an easy job to pay her rent. What she found instead was a nightmare that would rewrite her understanding of reality. As you listen, I want you to pay attention to the silence in your own room. Because sometimes the night shift never really ends. Sometimes the things we leave behind in the dark are just waiting for the right moment to follow us home. The Oakridge Galleria was a behemoth of concrete and glass, a shrine to 1986 consumerism that had been slowly dying for 2 decades. By 2014, it was a dead mall. Only about 15% of the storefronts were occupied. The big anchors, Sears, Macy's, had all pulled out, leaving massive, hollowed-out caverns at the 4 corners of the floor plan. My job was to walk a 4-mile loop through this carcass, 4 times a night. My name is Elena, and I was 21 years old when I took the position of night security supervisor. It was a title that sounded far more impressive than the reality of the job. In truth, I was just a girl with a heavy mag light and a radio, wandering through a graveyard of retail history while the rest of the world slept. The East Wing was the part I hated most. That was where Captain Cuddle's Pizza Palace sat. If you grew up in the Midwest in the late 80s, you knew Cuddles. It was the low-budget rival to Chuck E. Cheese, a place where the air always smelled of burnt cheese and cheap plastic. But while Chucky had a full band, Captain Cuddles usually stood alone, a 7-foot-tall animatronic walrus. The one at Oakridge was in terrible condition. His yellow raincoat was faded to a sickly mustard color, tattered at the edges, as if something had been chewing on it. His tusks were made of a yellowing plastic that looked uncomfortably like real bone in the dark. But it was his eyes that truly got to you. Oversized glass orbs with painted blue irises that were fixed in a permanent, wide-eyed stare. Because of the way the stage was built, he was always looking slightly down, right at the level of a child's face. Whenever I passed by on my rounds, those eyes seemed to catch the beam of my flashlight, reflecting a dull, artificial life back at me. My supervisor, a man named Dave, was a cynical 60-year-old who had worked at the Galleria since the day it opened. He spent most of his nights in the security hub, a small room buried in the center of the mall, surrounded by a dozen flickering black and white monitors. Dave was a man of few words and even fewer smiles. On my first night, he gave me a single piece of advice. Don't mess with the walrus, Elena. The hydraulics are old, and the pressure lines are shot. Sometimes the motors twitch when the building shifts. It's just physics. Ignore it, and it'll ignore you. I laughed it off at first. I was young, skeptical, and far more worried about real-life intruders or teenagers trying to film urban exploration videos than I was about a rusted pile of steel and foam. But the Galleria had a way of breaking down your skepticism. The silence there wasn't empty. It was heavy, as if the air itself was thick with the memories of a million shoppers. You'd hear things, faint whispers that turned out to be the wind in the vents, or the sound of footsteps on the floor above you that were actually just the foundation settling. At least, that's what I told myself for the first month. I kept my head down, listened to my podcasts, and walked my loops. I became a ghost in a building full of ghosts. Then came the storm of July 12th. It started around midnight, a massive Midwestern deluge that hammered against the mall's glass skylights with a sound like falling gravel. The thunder was a constant, low-frequency vibration that made the metal shutters of the stores rattle in their tracks. Around 1:30 a.m., the mall's primary power grid started to fail. The overhead lights didn't just flicker, they groaned. The high-voltage hum of the building changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I was standing near the center fountain, about 50 feet from the entrance to the Pizza Palace, when the first major surge happened. The lights turned a dull, angry orange, then sizzled out completely. For 5 long seconds, the mall was in absolute, crushing darkness. The only sound was the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then, the backup generators kicked in. The emergency lights, small, dim bulbs spaced far apart, flickered on. They didn't provide enough light to see clearly. They just cast long, distorted shadows across the tiles. They pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly red light, making the mall look like it was inside the ribcage of a dying beast. I turned my flashlight toward the Pizza Palace. I don't know why I did it. Some instinct, some deep-seated survival mechanism told me to check on the captain. Had moved. His head, which had been fixed toward the Sbarro across the way for the last month, was now turned 45 degrees. He was looking directly at the window. He was looking at me. I felt a cold sweat prickle my skin. I squeezed the handle of my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. "It's the power surge," I whispered. My voice was swallowed by the vastness of the atrium. The surge tripped a relay. "It's just a motor. It's just a machine." I took a step back, my boots squeaking on the linoleum. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of a heavy, industrial motor turning. The dry, grinding sound of metal against metal that had no business being active in a restaurant that had been closed for 20 years. Through the dusty, grease-stained window, I watched his right flipper. The fabric of his tattered raincoat crinkled as the metal arm underneath lifted an inch, then dropped. Lifted, dropped. It looked like he was trying to wave, but the movement was jerky, stuttering, like a film with missing frames. I grabbed my radio. My palm was sweating, making the plastic slippery. "Dave, you there? Dave, come in!" Static. Nothing but a hollow white noise that sounded like wind blowing through a graveyard. "Dave, the power surge messed with the electronics in the East Wing. The Pizza Palace mascot is acting up. I think there's a short circuit. Copy?" More static. Then, through the noise, I heard a sound. It wasn't Dave. It was music. It was the Captain Cuddles theme song, but it was slowed down, distorted by decades of tape rot and dampness. It was a high-pitched, warbling voice that sounded like it was coming from a throat full of wet sand. "Come to the sea with Cuddles and me. The voice wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from the Pizza Palace. The old speakers in the ceiling of the restaurant had hummed to life, powered by some phantom current in the backup lines. I took another step back, then another. I didn't want to be near that window anymore. I turned my back and started walking toward the West Wing, toward the security hub. I told myself I was going to find Dave. I told myself I was just being a coward. The lights flickered again. Click, darkness. Click. The red emergency glow returned. I looked back. Captain Cuddles wasn't in his booth. He was standing in the doorway of the restaurant. The glass door was slightly ajar, something I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps something he had pushed open. His 7-foot frame was hunched over, his yellow raincoat glowing a dull, bruised orange in the red light. His jaw was hanging open, revealing a dark, hollow throat filled with rusted iron struts and frayed wiring. My heart wasn't just beating. It was slamming against my ribs. I turned and ran. I didn't care about staying on the path anymore. I ran past the abandoned kiosks, past the empty fountains, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ceiling. Every time the red lights pulsed, I caught a glimpse of him. Pulse. He was at the edge of the food court. Pulse. He was 20 feet closer, standing next to a plastic palm tree. Pulse. He was at the end of the corridor I had just crossed. He wasn't walking. I realized that with a jolt of pure terror. He didn't have a walking animation. He was a stationary animatronic. He was gliding. I could hear the hiss of hydraulic fluid leaking onto the tiles. A rhythmic hiss-thud that echoed off the empty storefronts. It was the sound of 300 pounds of steel and foam being dragged across a floor by a force that didn't care about the laws of mechanics. I reached the north wing. This part of the mall was a long, straight shot toward the Sears anchor. It was a dead end, unless I could get through the heavy security gates into the warehouse, which I knew was locked from the other side. But there was a service door, a small steel door that led to the maintenance tunnels. My keycard should work there. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. My lungs were screaming, the air in the mall feeling thick and humid, smelling of old oil and something sweet and rotting, like a bag of oranges left in a hot car. I reached the service door and fumbled for my keycard. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped it. I knelt down, frantically feeling the floor in the dark as the red light pulsed. Pulse. He was at the start of the hallway. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted to the side like a curious dog. I found the card. I swiped it. The reader turned red. Access denied. No, I sobbed, swiping it again. No, please. Access denied. The power surge had fried the electronic locks. I was trapped. I turned around, pressing my back against the cold steel of the door. I shone my flashlight down the long corridor, He was closer. Every time the light flickered, he jumped forward 10, 20 feet. It was like he only existed when I wasn't looking, or when the light was off. He was now only 50 feet away. In the steady beam of my flashlight, he stayed still, but I could see his eyes. Those glass orbs were reflecting the light, glowing with a faint, inner luminescence that wasn't there before. The music was louder now. It was no longer a warbling song. It was a wall of agonizing, distorted noise, a screeching of metal, and a deep, guttural bass that made my vision blur. And then his jaw opened further. The hinges broke with a sickening crack, the yellow fur of his neck tearing away from the metal frame. He didn't have a tongue or teeth. He had a series of iron spikes and a speaker that was vibrating so hard I could see the dust shaking off his coat. A voice came out of him. It wasn't the song. "Elena," the walrus said. I froze. The voice was perfect. It was my own voice. It was the exact pitch, the exact tone, the exact way I pronounced my own name. It was like a recording of me had been fed into his rusted brain. "Elena," the thing said again, using my voice. "Why are you running? The water is so quiet. Come to the sea." I didn't wait to hear more. I took my mag light, the one that felt like a lead pipe, and I smashed it against the glass of a nearby storefront. It didn't break. I hit it again and again. I looked back. He was 10 feet away. I saw a heavy metal trash can bolted to the floor nearby. I ripped at it with a strength I didn't know I had, the bolts snapping out of the thin tile. I lugged the heavy container and hurled it at the glass. I put my hands over my ears and screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until the sound of my own voice drowned out the things outside. I stayed in that office for 4 hours. I didn't move. I didn't look through the crack in the door. I just sat in the dark, clutching a piece of broken glass I had pulled from my arm, ready to fight if the door gave way. When the sun finally rose, the mall felt different. The light of dawn filtered through the skylights, turning the red emergency glow into a pale, dusty gray. The silence returned, the real silence. I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The jewelry store was a wreck. Glass was everywhere. But when I looked out into the corridor, it was empty. I walked back toward the food court, my legs feeling like lead. I reached the pizza palace. The window was still shattered. And there, back on the stage, was Captain Cuddles. He was sitting in his booth. His yellow raincoat was perfectly still. His head was facing forward, looking at the empty tables. He looked like nothing more than a piece of junk, but as I got closer, I saw it. On the floor, right in front of the stage, was my key card, and next to it, a single, heavy ring of keys. Dave's keys. I didn't wait for the morning shift. I walked out of the main entrance, leaving the doors wide open, and I got into my car. I drove home, packed a bag, and left town that afternoon. I heard later that they found Dave 2 days later. They said he had a heart attack. They found him in the ventilation room, just as he always was. But the rumors in that town never died. The paramedics who found him said his body was different. They said his bones felt like they had been crushed. His ribcage flattened, as if a massive weight had sat on him for hours. And they said they found something in his throat, a small plastic blue iris, like the kind you'd find on an old animatronic. The Oakridge Galleria was demolished 6 months later. When the wrecking ball finally hit the East Wing, I watched the footage from a diner 3 states away. For a split second, the camera panned over the rubble. I saw a flash of yellow, a tattered raincoat buried under a ton of concrete. And for a moment, I could swear I saw a glass eye reflecting the sun, looking right into the lens. I don't go to malls anymore, because I know that when the world moves on and the buildings go dark, the things we left behind don't just disappear. They wait. They glide through the shadows, stealing our voices, waiting for the lights to flicker one last time. The incident at the Galleria was officially ruled as a series of electrical malfunctions and tragic accidents. The mall owners filed for bankruptcy shortly after the demolition, and the insurance companies fought the claims for years. But for those of us who were there, the official version of events is a joke. We know what we saw. We know the sounds that the machines made when they thought no one was listening. And we know that Captain Cuddles wasn't just a mascot. He was a vessel for something far older and hungrier than a pizza franchise. As we look back on the archives, we have to acknowledge the thousands of other dead malls across the country. Each one has its own mascots, its own forgotten corners, and its own secrets. The Oakridge Galleria was just the beginning. It was the first ripple in a pond that is still growing. And as the economy continues to shift, and more of these concrete giants are abandoned, the night shift will only get more crowded. So the next time you see a "coming soon" sign on a new development where an old mall used to stand, ask yourself, what exactly did they build over? And did they make sure the things in the basement were truly deactivated? My name is Elena, and I still sleep with the lights on. I still jump at the sound of a motor turning on. And I can't look at a yellow raincoat without feeling a cold hand on my shoulder. The archives are full of stories like mine. Stories of the things that hide in the light we choose to ignore. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and whatever you do, if you find yourself in an empty mall after midnight, don't look at the stage, because they are definitely looking at you. This concludes the first tape of the mall animatronic incident. But the night is still young, and the archives have many more secrets to reveal. We are just getting started. This is Maya, signing off for now. But remember, the archives are never truly closed.